It was a quiet, sunny afternoon in the small town of Brookhaven, a place where the streets were clean, the people were polite, and life seemed predictable. But, as it often happens in life, appearances can be deceiving. On this particular day, an encounter on the corner of Main Street would reveal just how deep some wounds run, even in a town that prided itself on being a community for everyone. In the heart of the bustling downtown area, Samuel Carter, a retired veteran and longtime resident of the town, stepped out of a cafe with a bag of groceries. His face bore the quiet dignity of a man who had seen both the best and worst of humanity during his years of service. At 65, his salt and pepper hair and strong posture spoke of a life well lived, though not without its share of struggles. Samuel was the kind of man who didn't demand attention, but earned respect wherever he went, at least from those who cared to know him. Just a few steps away, Officer Jake Reynolds was on patrol. Young, eager, and perhaps a bit too self-assured, Jake was a rookie cop with something to prove. He saw the world in black and white, right and wrong, good and bad. There wasn't much room in his mind for the complexities of human nature. To him, every situation was a test of his authority, and he was determined to pass with flying colors. Their paths were about to collide in a way that neither of them could have predicted. As Samuel adjusted the bag in his hands and began to cross the street, Jake noticed him. For reasons that only Jake could explain, something about Samuel caught his eye. Maybe it was the way he hesitated before stepping off the curb, or maybe it was just the color of his skin, a subconscious bias Jake would never admit to himself, let alone anyone else. Whatever it was, Jake felt compelled to act. He called out, "Hey, you. Stop right there." His voice was sharp, authoritative. Samuel, caught off guard, turned to see the young officer walking briskly toward him. Confused but compliant, Samuel stood still, his groceries clutched tightly in his hands. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Samuel asked, his tone calm but firm. Jake's eyes narrowed as he looked Samuel up and down. "I need to see some ID," he said, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, a gesture more for show than necessity. Samuel frowned. "I'm just coming back from the store. Is there a reason you're stopping me?" Jake didn't answer the question. Instead, he repeated his demand for ID, his voice growing more impatient. The interaction was drawing the attention of passers-by, who slowed their steps and exchanged curious glances. As the tension escalated, a young man in a sharp suit emerged from a nearby building. His stride was confident, his expression one of concern as he noticed the scene unfolding. This was Marcus Carter, Samuel's son, a rising star in the legal world and a name that many in Brookhaven recognized. But at this moment, Marcus was just a son witnessing something that didn't sit right with him. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, stepping closer. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that demanded attention. Jake glanced at Marcus, sizing him up. "Stay back," he warned. "This doesn't concern you." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm. "Actually, it does. That's my father you were talking to." For a split second, Jake faltered. He hadn't made the connection. How could he? To him, Samuel was just another face in the crowd, one he'd made assumptions about without knowing a single thing. What happened next would leave an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The situation spiraled out of control, misunderstandings piled on top of each other, and a single moment of recklessness changed everything. Samuel ended up in the hospital, his injuries a physical reminder of a deeper, more systemic issue. Jake, on the other hand, was left to grapple with the consequences of his actions, unaware that the man he'd hurt was not just a veteran, but also the father of someone whose influence could upend his entire career. As the story spread through Brookhaven, people began to take sides. Some defended Jake, claiming he was just doing his job. Others stood with Samuel and Marcus, pointing to the incident as yet another example of the prejudice that still lurked beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful town. And as for Jake, he would soon discover a truth that would shake him to his core, a truth about Samuel, Marcus, and the connections that bind us all in ways we often fail to see. What happened that day wasn't just an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a moment of reckoning, one that forced everyone involved to confront the biases and assumptions they carried with them. And as the dust settled, the question remained, would this be a turning point for change, or just another chapter in a long, painful history? This is the story of how one encounter revealed more than anyone was prepared to face. It's a story of prejudice, resilience, and the hidden truths that can bring people together or tear them apart. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the lives of Samuel, Marcus, and Jake, and uncover the lessons that their story has to teach us all. The sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance, though they weren't coming to this corner of Brookhaven. Life in the town carried on, as it always did, with people bustling about their daily routines. But for those who had stopped to witness the confrontation between Officer Jake Reynolds and Samuel Carter, the world had momentarily slowed down. Questions lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy, as Marcus Carter stood firm by his father's side. Marcus was no stranger to moments like this. Growing up as the son of a black veteran in a town where subtle prejudices often hid behind polite smiles, he had seen his father navigate countless encounters with dignity and patience. But this time felt different. This time, Marcus wasn't a quiet observer. He was a man armed not just with words, but with the knowledge and influence that came from years of fighting for justice in courtrooms across the state. As Jake stood there, the weight of Marcus's calm yet piercing gaze began to unsettle him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd made a mistake, though pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. Instead, he tightened his grip on his authority, determined not to lose control of the situation. "I don't care who he is," Jake said, his voice sharper now. "I asked for ID, and I expect compliance." Samuel raised a hand slightly, a gesture of peace. "Officer, I'm more than willing to cooperate, but I'd like to understand why you've stopped me in the first place. Is there something I've done wrong?" Jake hesitated, caught between the script he'd been trained to follow and the gnawing realization that he had nothing concrete to base his suspicions on. The crowd around them had grown, and Jake could feel the pressure of their silent judgment. Before he could respond, Marcus stepped forward, his tone measured but unyielding. "My father has the right to know why he's being questioned. If you have a legitimate reason, let's hear it. If not, I suggest you reconsider how you're handling this situation." The tension was palpable. Jake's eyes darted from Samuel to Marcus, then to the onlookers. He could feel his grip on the situation slipping, and in a desperate attempt to regain control, he reached for his radio. "I need backup at Main and 5th, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Marcus let out a slow breath, his expression unreadable. "Backup, huh? You really think this is necessary?" Jake didn't respond. The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to question his own actions. As they stood there, the past began to seep into the present, shaping the undercurrents of the moment. Samuel's years in the military had taught him the value of discipline and restraint. He'd served his country with honor, believing in the ideals of freedom and equality, even when those ideals didn't always seem to extend to him. He'd faced enemies abroad, but the battles he fought at home were often more insidious, small acts of prejudice that chipped away at his faith in humanity. Marcus, on the other hand, had grown up in a different era. While his father had taught him the importance of patience, Marcus's experiences as a black lawyer navigating predominantly white spaces had instilled in him a quiet but fierce determination to challenge injustice head-on. He admired his father's strength, but couldn't always reconcile it with his own instinct to push back. The intersection of their experiences had created an unspoken bond between them, a shared understanding of the world's complexities, even as they approached those complexities in different ways. And now, in this moment, their paths converged in a way that neither of them could have anticipated. The minutes stretched on, each one adding to the weight of the situation. The crowd began to murmur, their voices a mix of curiosity and unease. Among them was a young woman with a smartphone, her camera trained on the scene. She wasn't the only one recording. In an age where every moment could be broadcast to the world in an instant, the interaction was no longer just between Jake, Samuel, and Marcus. It had become a spectacle, a story unfolding in real time with an audience that stretched far beyond Brookhaven. Jake noticed the cameras and felt a surge of frustration. He wasn't a bad person. He'd become a cop because he wanted to make a difference, to protect and serve. But somewhere along the way, the weight of the badge had become a burden, blurring his judgment and hardening his heart. As the first squad car pulled up, 2 more officers stepped out, their expressions a mix of concern and caution. One of them, Officer Karen Lopez, had worked with Jake for a few months. She'd seen his temper flare on occasion, but hadn't expected to find him in a situation like this. "What's going on here?" Karen asked, her voice calm but firm. Jake started to explain, but his words faltered under the scrutiny of her raised eyebrow. Karen turned her attention to Samuel and Marcus, her gaze softening slightly. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked Samuel. Samuel nodded, though his expression betrayed his wariness. "I'm fine, officer. I was just trying to get home when this all started." Karen glanced back at Jake, her eyes narrowing. "Let's step aside for a moment," she said quietly, motioning for him to follow her. As they moved a few feet away, Marcus took the opportunity to address the crowd. "Thank you all for your concern," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to command attention. "But let's give the officers space to handle this. I assure you we'll be following up on this matter appropriately." The crowd began to disperse, though a few people lingered, their curiosity still piqued. Marcus turned to his father, his expression softening for the first time since the encounter began. "Are you sure you're okay, Dad?" Samuel managed a small smile. "I've been through worse," he said quietly, "but I appreciate you stepping in." Before Marcus could respond, Karen and Jake returned. Karen's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Carter," she said, addressing Samuel, "you're free to go. I apologize for any inconvenience this may have caused." Jake opened his mouth to protest, but Karen silenced him with a look. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, instead placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "Let's go, Dad," he said. As they walked away, the weight of the encounter settled heavily on them both. Marcus's mind raced with thoughts of what had just happened and what it meant, not just for his father, but for the town he'd always called home. Samuel, ever the stoic, remained silent, though his heart ached in a way he hadn't felt in years. Behind them, Jake stood rooted to the spot, watching as they disappeared into the distance. He didn't yet realize that this moment would follow him, shaping the days, weeks, and months to come. Nor did he know that the truth about Samuel and Marcus, the truth he had been blind to, was about to unravel everything he thought he knew. This wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning. The silence between Samuel and Marcus lingered as they walked back to Samuel's small house on the edge of town. It wasn't an awkward silence, but one heavy with unspoken words. Samuel's steps were steady, though the strain of what had just happened seemed to weigh on him more than he let on. Marcus, walking a step ahead, kept glancing back, as though checking to make sure his father was okay. When they finally reached the house, Samuel set his groceries on the kitchen table and sat down with a tired sigh. Marcus followed, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, his sharp eyes fixed on his father. "Dad," he began, his voice softer now, "you didn't have to stand there and let him treat you like that. You know that, right?" Samuel looked up, his expression calm but firm. "Son, there are battles worth fighting, and then there are battles where you just have to hold your ground without throwing a punch. I've lived long enough to know the difference." "But this wasn't just about you," Marcus said, his tone rising slightly. "That officer didn't see a veteran, didn't see a man who's given more to this country than most people ever will. He saw—" Marcus paused, the words catching in his throat. He saw what he wanted to see. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on his son. "And you think getting angry would have changed that? Trust me, Marcus, I've seen that look before. You don't fight ignorance with anger." You fight it with patience, with dignity. Marcus shook his head, his frustration evident. That's what you've always done, Dad. And where has it gotten us? People like that officer still think they can do whatever they want, say whatever they want, just because they wear a badge. Samuel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the coffee pot and poured himself a cup, the quiet clinking of the mug against the counter filling the room. I know you mean well, son, he said finally, but you have to pick your battles wisely. Not every fight needs to be a war. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his neatly trimmed hair. He admired his father's restraint, but he couldn't help feeling that it wasn't enough. He'd spent too many years in courtrooms, arguing against injustices just like this to believe that silence could ever lead to change. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Jake Reynolds was sitting at his desk in the small police station, staring at the blank report form in front of him. His hands hovered over the keyboard, but the words wouldn't come. Karen Lopez sat at the desk next to him, watching him out of the corner of her eye. You know, she said finally, breaking the silence, you messed up back there. Jake looked up sharply, his jaw tightening. I don't need a lecture, Karen. No, you need the truth, she said, her tone steady but firm. And the truth is, you stopped that man for no reason. You escalated a situation that didn't need escalating, and now the whole town is talking about it. Jake leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively. He looked suspicious, he muttered. Karen raised an eyebrow. Suspicious? Or was he just a black man carrying groceries on a sunny afternoon? The question hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. Jake didn't respond, but the flicker of guilt in his eyes didn't escape Karen's notice. She sighed and leaned forward, resting her elbows on her desk. Look, she said, her voice softening, I know you didn't mean for things to go the way they did, but intentions don't erase the impact. If you don't start questioning your own biases, you're going to keep making the same mistakes. Jake didn't reply, but Karen's words stayed with him long after she left the room. He thought about Samuel Carter, his calm demeanor, the quiet strength in his voice. Jake had assumed so much in that moment, but now, sitting alone in the dimly lit office, he couldn't remember why. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Brookhaven, Marcus sat at his laptop, typing furiously. He was drafting a letter to the local paper, detailing the incident and demanding accountability. His words were precise, each one chosen carefully to convey the gravity of what had happened. But even as he wrote, doubts crept into his mind. Was this the right approach? Would calling attention to the incident help, or would it only make things worse for his father? He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, and glanced at the photo on the corner of his desk, a picture of him and Samuel at Marcus's law school graduation. The memory brought a faint smile to his lips. His father had been so proud that day, standing in the crowd with tears in his eyes as Marcus accepted his diploma. It was a reminder of everything they'd been through together, of the sacrifices Samuel had made to give Marcus a better life. But it was also a reminder of why Marcus couldn't let this go. He owed it to his father, and to himself, to stand up for what was right, even if it wasn't easy. Back at the police station, Jake was still wrestling with his own thoughts. He replayed the encounter over and over in his mind, each detail sharper than the last. The way Samuel had looked at him, not with anger, but with disappointment. The way Marcus had stood his ground, refusing to back down. And then there was Karen's question, still echoing in his head. Or was he just a black man carrying groceries? Jake sighed and rubbed his temples, the weight of the day pressing down on him. For the first time, he began to wonder if he'd been wrong, not just about Samuel, but about everything he thought he knew about his job, about himself. Across town, Samuel sat on his porch, the cool evening breeze rustling the leaves of the old oak tree in his yard. He stared out at the quiet street, lost in thought. The day's events had stirred memories he hadn't visited in years, memories of a time when the world seemed even harsher, even more unforgiving. But Samuel wasn't a man who dwelled on the past. He believed in moving forward, in finding strength in the face of adversity. And as he sat there, listening to the faint hum of cicadas in the distance, he felt a quiet resolve take hold. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: his story wasn't over yet, and neither was the fight for the respect and dignity he, and so many others, deserved. The tension in Brookhaven seemed to ripple outward, touching everyone in subtle but noticeable ways. Samuel could feel it in the way neighbors hesitated just a fraction of a second longer before waving hello. Marcus sensed it in the guarded looks he received while walking to his car, and Jake, sitting in his patrol car near the edge of town, felt it in the weight of his own silence. It had been days since the incident, and the town was still buzzing with whispers. Some defended the officer, claiming he had only been doing his job. Others, particularly those who knew Samuel, spoke out with quiet but firm disapproval. Samuel had lived in Brookhaven for decades, and his reputation as a kind and steadfast man was well known. People struggled to reconcile the image of their neighbor with the account of a suspicious individual painted in the official report. Marcus wasn't one to wait for the world to correct itself. He worked late into the nights, poring over legal precedents, crafting statements, and gathering the accounts of those who had witnessed the confrontation. The local paper had published his letter, and the story began gaining attention far beyond Brookhaven. Social media picked it up, amplifying voices that demanded justice. Some posts went viral, with hashtags calling for accountability and systemic change. Still, Samuel remained quiet. He went about his days with the same steady rhythm, tending to his small garden and sipping coffee on his porch as if nothing had happened. But Marcus could see the weight on his father's shoulders, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Samuel wasn't one to seek the spotlight, but this time, the spotlight had found him. Meanwhile, Jake's internal conflict had reached a boiling point. He avoided Karen and barely spoke to his fellow officers, each interaction feeling like a confrontation waiting to happen. He'd spent hours rewatching his body cam footage, the confrontation playing out in vivid detail. He'd paused it at Samuel's face, the quiet dignity there, the way he didn't flinch even as Jake's tone grew sharper. The realization that he had been in the wrong gnawed at him, but Jake didn't know how to undo the damage he had caused. One evening, Jake found himself parked near the same grocery store where it all began. He watched as people came and went, their lives moving on while his felt stuck in place. He spotted a man struggling to load a heavy bag of dog food into his car and instinctively got out to help. The man thanked him, but the interaction did little to ease the turmoil in Jake's chest. Every act of kindness felt like a hollow attempt to balance the scales, and the scales, he knew, were far too tipped to ever even out. Back at Samuel's house, Marcus paced the living room, frustration bubbling over. "We need to push harder, Dad. The department hasn't even issued a formal apology. They're just waiting for this to blow over." Samuel looked up from his newspaper, his expression calm but firm. "And what would you have me do, son? March down to the station and demand they change their ways? That's not how this works." "No, but staying quiet isn't working either," Marcus shot back. "They're counting on you to let this go. They're counting on everyone to forget." Samuel folded the newspaper and set it aside, his gaze steady. "I haven't forgotten a thing, Marcus, but this isn't just about me. This is about how we choose to respond, how we carry ourselves when the world tries to tear us down. I won't give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. He admired his father's strength, but it frustrated him to no end. He wanted action, results, change. He wanted to see the look on that officer's face when he realized the depth of his mistake. What neither of them knew was that Jake was already grappling with that realization. The pressure was building from all sides: Karen's pointed remarks, the murmurs around town, the growing online backlash. He couldn't escape it, and part of him didn't want to. He felt like he deserved the scrutiny, the judgment, but guilt alone wasn't enough. He needed to do something, anything, to make it right. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. One morning, as Jake sat in the break room with Karen, Scrolling aimlessly through his phone, he saw a notification from a community group. It was a post about Samuel, a photo of him in his military uniform, taken years ago. The caption was simple but powerful. "This is the man they called suspicious." Jake stared at the photo for a long time, his stomach twisting into knots. He'd thought about his own father, a retired police officer who had always taught him to treat people with respect, to never let the badge become an excuse for arrogance. Jake wondered what his father would think of him now, and the thought was almost too much to bear. Karen, noticing the look on his face, spoke up. "You know, it's not too late to do the right thing." Jake looked at her, his jaw tightening. "And what's that, Karen? What's the right thing?" Karen shrugged, her tone calm but pointed. "That's for you to figure out. But sitting here and doing nothing, that's not it." That night, as the streets of Brookhaven grew quiet, Jake found himself driving to Samuel's house. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he had to say something. The weight of his actions and inaction had become unbearable. As he pulled up to the small house, he saw Samuel sitting on the porch, his silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of a porch light. For a moment, Jake hesitated. He considered turning around, driving away, pretending this was someone else's problem. But then he thought of the photo of Samuel standing tall in his uniform, and he knew he couldn't run from this. Jake stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting him like a wake-up call. He took a deep breath and walked toward the porch, his heart pounding in his chest. Samuel looked up as Jake approached, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither man spoke, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. "Mr. Carter," Jake began, his voice faltering slightly. I need to talk to you." Samuel didn't reply immediately. He studied Jake for a long moment, his calm gaze unwavering. Finally, he nodded and gestured to the empty chair beside him. Jake hesitated, then sat down, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. The conversation that followed would change everything, but for now, the tension hung in the air, thick and unrelenting. Both men knew they were standing on the edge of something that could either bring resolution or deepen the divide. And as the night stretched on, the weight of their shared humanity became impossible to ignore. The porch light flickered faintly, as though sensing the gravity of the moment unfolding beneath it. Jake sat awkwardly on the edge of the chair, his hands clasped tightly, while Samuel leaned back, calm and unreadable as ever. The silence between them stretched until it felt like it might crack under its own weight. Jake searched for the words, but every sentence he rehearsed in his mind felt too shallow, too small to bridge the gap between them. "I'm not here to make excuses," Jake finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "What I did was wrong, and I've been carrying that with me every day since it happened." Samuel nodded slightly, his expression giving away nothing. Jake's words hung in the air, waiting for some kind of response, but none came. The silence felt like judgment, and maybe it was. Jake pressed on, his voice tightening with emotion. "I didn't see you for who you are," he admitted. "I didn't take the time. I let assumptions, fear, and—" He hesitated, the word catching in his throat. "Ignorance get the better of me. I don't know if you can forgive me, but I needed to say that I'm sorry." Samuel's eyes softened, though his demeanor remained steady. "Sorry is just a word, Officer Bradley," he said, his tone measured. "It's what comes after that matters." Jake nodded, his shoulders sagging as though a small weight had been lifted, only to be replaced by a heavier one. "I know," he said. "That's why I want to make things right." Before Samuel could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled both men's attention toward the street. A black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the house, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Marcus stepped out, his face a mix of confusion and suspicion as he saw Jake sitting there. He approached slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What's going on here?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp. Jake stood, hands raised slightly as if to show he meant no harm. "I came to talk to your father," he said, to apologize. Marcus's jaw tightened, and he turned to Samuel. And you're just letting him sit here after everything he's done? Marcus, Samuel said calmly, his tone carrying a quiet authority that could silence a storm. Let the man speak. But Marcus wasn't having it. You don't get it, Dad, he said, his frustration spilling over. This isn't just about you. It's about what this represents, what it means for people like us who've had to deal with this kind of treatment our whole lives. An apology doesn't fix that. Jake flinched at Marcus's words, the truth of them hitting harder than any accusation. You're right, Jake said, his voice steady but laced with regret. It doesn't fix anything. But I want to do more than just apologize. I want to make amends. Marcus scoffed, crossing his arms. And how do you plan to do that? You can't undo what you did. Before Jake could respond, Samuel spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. That's enough, Marcus. Let the man finish. Reluctantly, Marcus fell silent, though the tension in his posture remained. Jake took a deep breath, his eyes flickering between father and son. I've been working on something, he said. A way to address what happened, not just to you, Mr. Carter, but to anyone who's been treated unfairly by the system. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. And what's that supposed to mean? Jake hesitated, then pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He handed it to Samuel, who unfolded it carefully. The paper detailed a proposal, a community initiative aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. It included programs for cultural sensitivity training, community engagement events, and oversight measures to ensure accountability within the department. I know it's not enough, Jake said, his voice quiet, but it's a start, and I've already taken it to the chief. He's agreed to review it, but only if we can show that the community supports it. Samuel read the proposal carefully, his expression unreadable. Marcus, meanwhile, looked at Jake as though trying to decide whether this was some elaborate performance. So now you want us to help you fix your broken system? Marcus said, his tone sharp. That's convenient. It's not about fixing the system overnight, Jake replied, his voice tinged with frustration. It's about taking responsibility and doing what I can to make things better. Before Marcus could respond, Samuel folded the paper and set it on the small table beside him. It's a step, he said simply, his tone carrying a weight that silenced further argument. But just as the conversation seemed to reach a fragile truce, the sound of another vehicle approaching broke the moment. A second car pulled up, and out stepped a man in a suit, his presence commanding attention. It was the mayor, and his expression was one of urgency. Mr. Carter, the mayor said, his gaze shifting uneasily between Samuel and Jake. I just came from a meeting at the station. There's been a development you need to know about. Samuel's brow furrowed, and Marcus stepped closer, his protective instincts kicking in. What kind of development? Marcus demanded. The mayor hesitated, glancing at Jake before speaking. There's evidence that the incident with Officer Bradley wasn't isolated. A whistleblower came forward with information about systemic issues within the department, cases of profiling, cover-ups, and worse. It's all about to come to light. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, the implications hitting each man differently. For Samuel, it was a confirmation of what he'd long suspected. For Marcus, it was fuel to his already burning anger. And for Jake, it was a crushing blow, a reminder of the rot within the institution he'd sworn to serve with integrity. As the mayor continued to speak, the tension on the porch reached a breaking point. The stakes had just been raised, and the path forward was now fraught with even more uncertainty. The fragile threads of trust and accountability that Jake had been trying to weave seemed on the verge of unraveling entirely, and as the night deepened, it became clear that the conflict was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The air felt heavy as everyone stood on the porch, absorbing the mayor's revelation. Jake's face paled, the weight of his uniform suddenly feeling unbearable. He knew there were issues within the department, small things he'd witnessed and brushed aside, thinking they weren't his responsibility. But now, hearing about the systemic corruption laid bare, he realized he'd been complicit in ways he couldn't ignore. Samuel and Marcus exchanged a look, unspoken understanding passing between them. This wasn't just a moment for accountability, it was an opportunity to demand real change. Before anyone could respond, the mayor continued. The whistleblower has shared names, dates, and documents. It's not just a few officers. This goes deep. If this gets out, it will shake the entire department to its core. Samuel finally broke the silence. His voice was calm, but carried a force that demanded attention. Then let it get out. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. If there's rot in the system, people deserve to know. Jake nodded, surprising even himself. He's right, he said. If I'm going to be part of this, I can't hide from the truth. But Marcus, still bristling with anger, crossed his arms tightly. And what about all the people who've already suffered because of this? He asked. An apology doesn't erase what's been done. Transparency is a start, but it doesn't heal wounds. The tension between them was electric, but before the conversation could escalate, the sound of a phone ringing broke through. The mayor pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his expression darkening as he read the caller ID. It's the chief, he said quietly, stepping away to take the call. The seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Finally, the mayor returned, his face pale. There's been a leak, he said. The documents are already online. The media's running with it. This is going to blow up fast. Samuel stood, his calm demeanor unshaken. Then it's time to make sure the right story gets told, he said. Not just the headlines, but the truth. Jake felt a strange mix of dread and determination. He looked at Samuel and Marcus, the weight of their gazes forcing him to confront the depth of his responsibility. I'll speak up, he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. I'll tell the media what I've seen and what I'm trying to do to fix it. Marcus hesitated, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. You better mean that, he said, because if this is just another PR stunt, it's going to blow up in your face. Jake met his eyes, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. I mean it, he said. This isn't just about saving face, it's about doing what's right. The mayor sighed, glancing between them. If we're doing this, we need to act fast. The press will be all over this by morning. Samuel nodded, his steady presence a source of strength for everyone on the porch. Then let's start now, he said. The truth doesn't wait. What followed was a whirlwind of phone calls, meetings, and preparations. Samuel, Marcus, and Jake worked together, though the tension between them remained palpable. They crafted a statement, ensuring that the voices of those most affected by the system's failures were at the forefront. Jake agreed to go on record, sharing his own experiences and calling for accountability within the department. As the night wore on, the weight of the situation pressed down on everyone. But just when it seemed like things were moving toward resolution, an unexpected twist emerged. A second whistleblower came forward, this time from outside the police department. They revealed evidence that certain community leaders, including the mayor himself, had been complicit in covering up the department's misconduct for years. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through the fragile alliance on the porch. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his anger now directed at the mayor. You knew about this, he demanded. You let it happen. The mayor raised his hands defensively. I didn't have a choice, he said. I tried to push for change, but the system fought back. They threatened my family, my career. I thought I could do more good from the inside. Samuel's expression hardened, disappointment flashing across his face. You had a choice, he said quietly, and you chose wrong. The group splintered, the unity they'd been building now threatened by this new betrayal. But Jake, for the first time, found his voice. We can't let this derail us, he said. Yes, the mayor messed up, but if we turn on each other now, the system wins. We need to stay focused on what matters, fixing this. It was a pivotal moment, one that tested the resolve of everyone involved. Samuel looked at Jake, the weight of decades of struggle in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "You're right," he said, "but trust is earned. And right now, none of us have the luxury of blind faith." As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the group prepared to face the day ahead. The media frenzy was already in full swing, and the path forward was fraught with uncertainty. But for the first time, there was a sense of possibility, a glimmer of hope that, despite the odds, change might finally be within reach. And as they stepped out into the world, each carrying their own burdens, they knew the fight was only just beginning. The hours that followed felt like a whirlwind, a blur of conversations, confessions, and difficult truths coming to light. By the time the sun was high in the sky, the full weight of the scandal had broken across the city. News channels were camped outside City Hall, and the whistleblower's revelations were the top story everywhere. It was impossible to avoid, and maybe that was the point. The truth, in all its painful complexity, was finally out in the open. Jake stood at the precinct, surrounded by reporters, his chest tight as microphones were shoved toward him. He had prepared himself for this moment, but no amount of practice could have made it easier. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "I'm here today, not as a defense of myself, but as an acknowledgement of what has gone wrong. What I allowed to go wrong, and how we can do better. This isn't just about one officer or even one department. It's about a culture that must change, starting with accountability." Samuel and Marcus watched from the sidelines, their expressions unreadable. Marcus still had doubts about Jake's sincerity, but Samuel gave a small nod of approval. For all their differences, they knew this moment mattered. When Jake finished, the reporters turned their attention to Samuel, eager for his perspective. Samuel hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. "This isn't the end of the fight," he began. "This is just the start of a longer journey toward justice. It's easy to point fingers, but what we need now is systemic change. That means listening to the people most affected and ensuring their voices guide the path forward." The crowd murmured, cameras flashing as Samuel continued. He spoke with the conviction of someone who had spent a lifetime fighting for his community, his words cutting through the noise. "We've heard a lot of promises over the years," he said, "but promises don't rebuild trust. Actions do. And it's on all of us, officers, leaders, citizens, to ensure those actions happen." Afterward, the group reconvened at a small community center. It felt like neutral ground, a space away from the chaos outside. The mayor joined them, looking haggard but resolute. "I know I've let you down," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to help fix this. If that means stepping down, I'll do it." Samuel shook his head. "It's not about one person stepping down," he replied. "It's about what comes next. You need to use your position to dismantle the very system you were complicit in protecting. That's how you make amends." The mayor nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what Samuel was asking. "I'll do it," he said, "whatever it takes." Over the following weeks, a series of sweeping reforms began to take shape. Independent oversight committees were established to investigate misconduct, and community leaders were given a seat at the table to guide future policies. Training programs were overhauled to focus on de-escalation and bias awareness, and officers who had been implicated in the scandal were placed under investigation. Jake stayed on the force, but his role changed. He became a vocal advocate for reform, using his platform to push for accountability from within. It wasn't an easy transition. He faced criticism from both his colleagues and the community, but he remained committed to the path he had chosen. For Marcus, the journey was more personal. He spent time reconnecting with his father, learning more about the experiences Samuel had endured and the resilience that had carried him through. The anger that had fueled Marcus for so long began to soften, replaced by a determination to carry his father's legacy forward in a constructive way. One evening, as the sun set over the city, the three men found themselves sitting together on Samuel's porch. The air was warm, the hum of cicadas filling the silence between them. It was a rare moment of peace, a chance to reflect on how far they'd come. "I never thought I'd see the day when things started to change," Samuel said, his voice tinged with both pride and exhaustion. "But we're not done yet. This is just the foundation. The real work is building on it." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I used to think the system was too broken to fix," he admitted. "But maybe it's not about fixing everything all at once. Maybe it's about chipping away at it, piece by piece." Jake smiled faintly, his uniform hanging loosely on his frame as if it no longer defined him. "You're right," he said. "It's not about perfection, it's about progress." As the night deepened, they sat in companionable silence, the weight of their shared experiences forging a bond that transcended their differences. They knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, there was a sense of possibility, a belief that change, however slow and messy, was within reach. The scandal that had rocked the city began to fade from the headlines, replaced by new stories and crises. But for those who had been part of it, the lessons remained. It was a reminder that justice isn't a destination, it's a journey, one that requires courage, humility, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. And as Samuel, Marcus, and Jake parted ways at evening, each heading back to their own lives, they carried with them a shared understanding. The fight for justice isn't about one moment or one person. It's about the countless small actions that, over time, can change the course of history.